And I could come to a place where I become entirely unreasonable. And now Nebuchadnezzar is going to go a step further, and he's going to challenge God. He's going to challenge God. Verse 15. Now, if ye be ready, that at what time ye hear the sound of the cornet, flute, harp, sackbut, psaltery, and dulcimer, and all kinds of music, ye fall down and worship the image which I have made well. But if ye worship not, ye shall be cast in the fiery, or in the same hour into the midst of the burning fiery furnace. And here is the challenge. And who is that capital G-O-D, God, that shall deliver you out of my hands? And here we find that Nebuchadnezzar does not reference what God is able to. He references who is Jehovah God who's able to deliver you out of my hands. Who is Adonai? Who is the God, the Creator, Elohim, who's able to deliver you out of my hands? And now Nebuchadnezzar has put himself in a place that belongs to God. And now he's gone a step further than that. He's challenged God himself. Friend, I don't believe that tonight that God was under an obligation to spare Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. You see, God's God regardless of whether or not Nebuchadnezzar challenged him or not. And God could have dealt with Nebuchadnezzar in many different ways. He could have smote him dead on the spot. But Nebuchadnezzar, and I think this is another sign that God loved Nebuchadnezzar. And you look at the mercy of God toward this man who was so prideful. God was very merciful to him. Aren't you glad of that? Aren't you glad, by way of application tonight, that God is merciful toward prideful individuals? You see, Nebuchadnezzar doesn't continue in his pride. He learns his lesson. He has to learn it a few times, but he does learn it. So the question is, can God deliver you from me? And the challenge here by Nebuchadnezzar is, it's okay to worship God, but I'm greater. At least I'm more relevant. And many individuals think they're more relevant than God. Now, we have got to go to the flip side of the application tonight. We've been looking at it from Nebuchadnezzar's perspective. Now let's begin to look at it from the perspective of God's servants, Hananiah, Mishael, and that's Hananiah, Azariah, and Mishael. Do you think it might have been simple for them to bow to the image if they didn't fear God? Everyone else in the kingdom had no trouble bowing to this image. You say, where was Daniel? Well, he evidently wasn't present, or they didn't dare mess with him. But everyone else around were bowing to this image. And it would have been easy for them to go along with the masses. But I want to remind you of two things. First of all, the Chaldeans noticed. The Chaldeans noticed. And I would submit to you this evening that as much as they noticed that the men did not bow, they would have noticed that they bowed as well. Many times you and I think that compromise will make opposition go away. But I would submit to you this evening, if you look at this text and you look at these individuals who are opposed not just to these men, but were opposed to their God, that just as much as they noticed that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego did not bow, they would have noticed had they bowed. You ever compromised, Christian? You ever compromised? And then the individual who hated God came to you and said, notice you compromised. You ever had that happen? Notice you lost your temper. Notice you fell into sin there. And I want to say to you, Christian, that it's far better to be on the side of not compromise and facing the wrath of the one who hates God than to be on their side and face the wrath of holy God. And so we find that very plainly spelled out in the answer of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Nebuchadnezzar says, if you will bow down when we have the music play, well, or good, you'll survive. But if you won't bow down God, God can't save you from me. And the answer of these men, from their perspective, was this. Christian, I don't know, this might be a good verse to memorize. If it be so, they said, "Oh, Nebuchadnezzar, we're not careful to answer you in this matter." They said, "We don't have to think about this. We don't have to decide what the right thing is to do. We're not careful to answer you in this matter." What does the language indicate? Well, you better be careful how you talk to a king, right? You better watch what you say to Nebuchadnezzar, and you better not say the wrong thing, because death and life is in his hands. But in this situation, when Nebuchadnezzar has made a brazen statement that said, "God himself cannot deliver you from me," they said, "Nebuchadnezzar, we don't need to think about this. If it be so, this is the way it is, our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace, and he'll deliver us out of thy hand, O king." This is an interesting statement. They were not making by this statement the declaration that God would not allow him to put them in the fiery furnace. The declaration here is that, "King, there's nothing you can do ultimately to us, because God will deliver us from you." Nebuchadnezzar, would you like to torture us? Well, you can torture us, but you can't take our soul. Would you like to kill us? If God allows you to, you can kill us, but you can't take our soul. And so ultimately their answer is, if you burn us in the furnace and God chooses to deliver us, fine. If he doesn't choose to deliver us, then we're delivered from you either way. You know, one thing about killing somebody is you can't do much more to them after that. Once you kill them, it's hard to torture them anymore. I think that's why sometimes employers don't fire employees. Once you fire them, you can't do anything to them anymore. You can just needle them and pester them as long as they've got to have. I see people laughing. You almost work for those people. It's like, keep them hired just so that you can make their life miserable because you can hold that over them. Well, in a sense, what Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego said is, "King, you can throw us in a fiery furnace, but you can't make us bow. And you can't mess with our souls. We're free from you. This is an area where you do not have authority." Does it remind you of anything? When the apostles said we ought to obey God rather than men? Hey, this is a matter that we don't have to be careful about. We know the truth of it. And so here's the answer. "But if not, if God doesn't deliver us," verse 18, "be it known unto thee, O king, that we will not serve thy gods, nor worship the golden image which thou hast set up." How about character? You want to look at some application here. You see, on the one hand, an individual who knows God, who knows who he is, and yet has somehow brought himself to a place where he has superseded God. He's placed himself in a position that belongs to God. He's made demands that have put him in opposition with God's people. And on top of all of that, he has challenged God himself, saying, "God cannot deliver you from me." On the other hand, we have some individuals that recognize that probably they're going to lose their lives. And they're probably going to die. But they are so governed by justice, by God being God, and they being his servants. By the way, do they know anything about God's answering prayer and delivering them? A little bit, right? You remember when they determined along with Daniel that they wouldn't eat the portion of the king's meat and defile themselves? They know a little bit about it. You know what governed that circumstance and governs this one as well? Right and wrong. Christian, we live in a day and age that is referred to by the people who live in it as the postmodern society. We're a postmodern age. In case you didn't know what day and age we're living in, it's postmodern. You know what the modern age was, right? You know that people that are just about the age of Brother Kent grew up when there was no running water, no electricity, no automobiles, no airplanes. And all that was developed in the last 100 years or so. And I think you're younger than 100, aren't you, brother? All right. He knew Moses.